Greetings Ranger fans, Jake here for a deeper look at episode 33 of Power Rangers Dino Fury, the Copycat. But first, a rapid run through. Let's kick off the counter. It's morphin' time. Okay, so we open on a plaza where Javi meets up with the others talking about the upcoming Buzz Blast Song-a-thon competition where he'll be performing his original number, Spotlight. Warden Garcia swings by for support and he plays a quick bit before they head off to Buzz Blast where the judges, Simon, Beck, and Owen, watch Pop-Up sing a wacky fix-it fiddle number before Blair from the Screaming Zombies performs his original number, Spotlight. Javi calls him out, but the judges say there's no proof who wrote the song, even though there probably could be. So they shift Javi to the final slot for the next day to give him time to figure out a new performance while Mucus watches the stream at Area 62, suggesting to Void Queen that they should try copying something to beat the Rangers, but she's already ahead of her as she activates the jukebox device. With Tarek still in the tank, Javi struggles with songwriting down in the base, but the Rangers are called out to protect the city from a new villain with a very familiar voice, which they totally don't recognize. Kicking off a fight where he totally wrecks everyone but Zato and Javi before revealing his identity. Surprise, it's Tarek! He's been reshaped by Spork's energy into Void Queen's newest servant, Void King. So Zato sends Javi off to take care of the others while he summons the Dino armor to fight Void King, who perfectly mimics his Dino strike, forcing the Red Rangers retreat, so Javi offers to let Zato train against his own abilities by using the Dino more for himself. Shoot Dino versus Dino Fury Red. After a quick limbo dodge, they realize the Dino strike takes a moment to recharge, giving Zato the chance to get the drop on Javi, who returns to songwriting with a new idea just before Solon and Zato learn that Void King is attacking the stadium. Time for round 2. Void King performs another Dino strike, which Zato catches with his claw to deflect, charging up for his own strike before the brainwashed baddie can recharge, nailing his target and forcing a retreat, so Zato returns to the base victorious. And everyone's woken up without it taking 65 million years. Javi chastises him for going alone, but Zato owes him for the strategy and agrees to be Javi's assistant for his new strategy in the Song-a-thon, where he performs Spotlight on his guitar until Zato wheels out some new instruments, guitar, bass, and harmonica. And Javi rotates between all four, bringing his mastery of multiple musical instruments to the stage, bringing down the house just before one last surprise remote performance by Mew Mew. Mucus performs a pop number with henchmen backup dancers, but Slither gets jealous, so Wreckmate blasts her into slime, meaning the judges' scores and online votes declare Javi the winner, earning a big trophy that his dad immediately grabs to take selfies with. Roll credits. And that's the end of the episode. Now, let's take a deeper look. Here we are at yet another mid-season finale, and in this case, due to the new Netflix distribution model for the series, it looks like this may be one of our longest mid-season breaks yet, as the first 11 episodes of the season all simultaneously dropped on March 3rd, and we likely won't be seeing the final 11 episodes until late summer or possibly fall, depending on whether they're aiming for when the mid-season premieres usually happen, or repeating last year's second half Netflix drop, or just something else entirely. As a result, there is something of a sense that these first 11 episodes should function as a cohesive whole, with this episode acting as the culmination of this stage of the story, as well as teasing what we may be able to expect for the fourth and final stage of Dino Fury's run. And honestly, despite being largely structured more like a standalone story, this episode does actually seem to accomplish that goal. Especially if you look at things from a character perspective rather than a story perspective. Obviously, the biggest story impact in this episode comes from the introduction of Void King, Tarek's powerful and ruthless new form, which not only cleverly merges him with late-stage Ryusoulger villain Precious to extend usable source footage for the character, but does so through the use of the same Spork's energy transfer that created Void Queen. This feels incredibly fitting, as Tarek's character arc has not only been one of the most compelling of the series, but also the one that has received the most focus and development across the course of this 11-episode span, as we have seen him restore his armor, accomplish his goal of powering his machine, use the Spork's energy to restore Santora, witness her use of that same energy to corrupt herself into Void Queen, recognize the error of his ways and join up with the Rangers, and then finally face the irony of his resurrected love using the same power that he'd spent the entire series hunting to corrupt him into a heartless monster. The dramatic irony is very strong on this reveal. And yet, despite that, it's not actually treated as this episode's main source of dramatic tension. Now, to a certain extent, this is understandable, as the reveal is not really a terribly surprising one, as a reformed villain being brainwashed back into the service of evil is a trope that goes all the way back to Astronema and Ecliptor's cybernetic reprogramming back in Power Rangers in Space, mirrored later with Tenaya 7's near-identical turn into Tenaya 15 in Power Rangers RPM. However, in all of these cases, these reveals were still pretty heavily foreshadowed, and the emotional impact didn't really stem from the surprise so much as it did from the pathos experienced by other characters. Specifically, Andros and Dylan both being utterly crushed from re-experiencing the loss of their respectively rediscovered long-lost sisters. So while Tarek's brainwashing isn't really any more heavily foreshadowed or any less tragic, it doesn't really have the same gut punch for a very simple reason. He's not anyone's sister. By which I mean there are no other characters in the show that are actively invested in his redemption, and therefore no one to experience that emotional devastation at his return to villainy on behalf of the audience. Which is an ironic downside to the otherwise innovative nature of his redemptive arc being so incredibly self-driven. None of the other villains appear sympathetic to, or, with the exception of Void Queen, even aware of his brainwashing, and the Rangers are far too focused on dealing with him as a threat to even concern themselves with his tragic plight. Not that they were really all that concerned for him to begin with. Which actually brings me to a small point that I failed to address when taking a deeper look at Losers Weepers. While the show has done an excellent job developing Tarek's character and building up sympathy within the audience, it seems to be decidedly more ambivalent when it comes to how other characters are supposed to feel about him. Beyond the oddity of Slither and Wreckmate, robotic generals that he literally built himself, suddenly switching sides to serve Void Queen immediately upon her introduction, Santora's plans for Tarek have also been somewhat inconsistent, initially insisting that Track and Slash ignore the Rangers to focus on destroying him, then switching over to creating Snag-Eye to capture the Rangers without any explicit plan involving Tarek, then suddenly deciding to capture him in her old life support tank and ultimately converting him into Void King here. Definitely no long-term plan on her part, regardless of the confidence with which she seems to be proceeding. But then there are the Rangers. Despite seeing him get captured by Void Queen and actively admitting that they owed him a debt at the end of the hunt, none of the Rangers displayed any interest in his rescue beyond a general curiosity over his fate, with not a single one of them even mentioning him during Losers Weepers. And that lack of concern carries over into this episode, as despite Tarek ostensibly earning the trust of both Zato and Javi during the course of the hunt, and both of them actively being the ones dealing with him during the course of this episode, neither of them express any interest in trying to return him to normal. Which, I'm not going to lie, really isn't the most heroic look for either of them here. But that's enough on what this episode fails to focus on. Let's look at what it chooses to prioritize instead. Javi may no longer be continuing his empathetic advocacy of Tarek from the hunt, but he is continuing to build upon his relationship with his father, who proves that his new support for Javi's musical career that was promised in Jam Session and alluded to in the hunt is more than just empty words. Warden Carlos Garcia has now shifted to being fully on board with his son's burgeoning music career, encouraging him to practice, cheering him on, and advocating on his behalf with the Song-a-thon music competition. And despite it being a major shift in attitude, it still feels very much in character for him to behave this way, based off of how he has previously been observed supporting Izzy's athletic pursuits. The dude still has a competitive streak a mile wide, but at least now it's been readjusted a bit to better align with Javi's passions. And this follow-up to Jam Session feels both very welcome and deeply necessary from a character perspective. As I've said before, one of my chief issues with the Warden's change of heart was that it felt like words were insufficient, given his previously harsh mistreatment of his son. And Javi's reference to him having changed during the conversation with Zato in the hunt felt like it wasn't really earned, as we had yet to see those words backed up with actual action. If the arc had just ended there, it would have felt like something of a hollow resolution to Javi and Carlos's character arc. But here we get to actually see them both working on improving their relationship, feeling much more comfortable around one another as Carlos is clearly making the effort to display active support as Javi displays patience for his father's sometimes rough around the edges obsession with excellence. These are the elements that make this episode feel like a culmination. Tarek's transformation may not feel like it's given sufficient emotional weight, but oddly enough, Javi's character focus somehow does. I've spoken before about Javi was the hardest Ranger to really get a bead on during Season 1, but he's really come into his own during this season, finally recognizing that he wants to focus on his music career, continuing to prove his worth at Buzzblast, standing up to his father, learning to better understand his sister, and rising to become almost a second-in-command for Zato. First by empathetically advocating for Void Knight during the hunt, and now working to help Zato defeat Void King here, and even calling him out for taking the villain on solo. His participation in the Song-a-thon also opens up the door for a number of other minor character moments. As Jane continues to build up the community surrounding BuzzBlast, Jay Borg improves her competency as a producer, Mucus actually gets to somewhat literally live out her musical performance dreams from back in Waking Nightmares, and Blair makes a surprise return to finally receive some comeuppance for his selfish attitude and his mistreatment of his now former bandmates from the Screaming Zombies. Plus, Javi's final winning performance is a fantastically cathartic moment to end on, as he makes incredibly satisfying use of every musical instrument he has mastered over the course of the series, with the exception of the violin and whistle referenced back in Stego Search. But I guess he didn't want to risk summoning the Stego Spike Sword. The lesson he learns is also something of an unexpected one, as the strategy that both he and Zato employ to deal with their respective copycats is not actually to change up their tactics or to copy someone else, but to actually focus on developing a deeper understanding of their own skills to ultimately outmaster the two frauds. This ultimately leads not only to Javi delivering a much more impressive musical performance, but also to some very engaging battle sequences, especially the clever approach of having Javi use the Dino Knight Morpher to allow for what is essentially a Red Ranger versus Red Battleized Ranger training sequence. However, despite the innovative ways that these situations are resolved, the manner in which they're set up don't necessarily always make the most sense. And this is why this episode is so much more satisfying from a character perspective than it is from a story perspective. Unlike with his source material counterpart Precious, we never really receive any explanation of Void King's ability to copy Zato's moves. Specifically, whether it's an ability that can be applied to any Ranger, or if it's specifically due to Tarek's original Void Knight powers being derived from the Dino Knight powers, since he obviously had no opportunity to mirror the move directly before using it as Void King. This is also not getting into the oddity of the source footage, where Zato initially develops a strategy of dodging the Dino Knight strike, but then ultimately decides to deflect it in the final battle. Or why it is that the Song-a-thon has judges that don't seem to have any actual power to judge anything, ultimately shrugging their shoulders over the question of who wrote Javi's song when determining authorship of a song in a songwriting competition is like half the reason for even having judges? I mean, I can understand there being a tight timeline where you don't have time to research the origins of the song, especially if there are no existing protocols in place, but this is an annual competition with online voters. You should have those protocols in place. I love the names though. The names are great. Simon, Becca, and Alwyn, I see you, and that's adorable. And it's the little character notes like that that provide the main strength of this episode, as we get touches like Ollie's bad singing, Ion recalling his 65 million year snooze, Mucus watching BuzzBlast, and Slither getting jealous over someone else getting the spotlight, as we end up seeing nearly every recurring member of the cast, shy of Dr. Akana, along with a returning guest character in the form of Blair. This is what makes this episode feel like an appropriate culmination of this half of the season, possibly even more so than Tarek's tragic transformation into Void King. Because even though the story here definitely has some flawed logic and skewed priorities, it still displays a strong love of the characters that have been slowly built up across the course of a season and a half. After all, whenever the series next returns to Netflix, that will mark the end of the story. So let's let these characters have their spotlight. So make sure to join me later this year for a deeper look at episode 34 of Power Rangers Dino Fury. And if you would like to share this week's rapid run-through, you can find it as a standalone clip over at Morphin Legacy's YouTube channel. Please like, share, subscribe to us both, ring the bell for future notifications, and until next time, farewell Ranger fans, and let the power protect you.